Sometimes the deepest wounds come from those we trust most, leaving us standing alone when we need them most. Every heart deserves a second chance at love, even when that chance comes in the most unexpected way. When Dinah Keane gets abandoned. At the altar in Prairie Bluff, giant cowboy Thad Reilly steps forward to marry her instead. He thinks he's just helping a woman in need and gaining help for his struggling ranch. But Dinah arrives with her two sisters, and suddenly his quiet home becomes filled with three women who refuse to be separated. His simple plan turns complicated when he realizes this unexpected family might be exactly what his empty ranch and lonely heart have been missing. What happens when the woman you married out of kindness becomes the one you can't imagine living without? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Prairie Bluff in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the weathered buildings that lined Main Street. This was a town where everyone knew their neighbor's business before their neighbor did, where the church bell still called folks to Sunday service, and where a man's word meant more than any contract written on paper. At the edge of town, where the prairies stretched endlessly toward the horizon, sat the Reilly Ranch, 500 acres of stubborn grassland that had been in the family for 3 generations. Thad Reilly stood 6 feet 6 inches. In his worn leather boots, a mountain of a man with hands the size of dinner plates and shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. At 32, he possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from years of working the land, wrestling cattle, and facing down nature's worst storms. His dark hair, perpetually tousled by prairie winds, framed a face that was more honest than handsome. Strong jaw, kind brown eyes, and a mouth that spoke only when words were needed. The ranch house itself told the story of better times. Built by his grandfather in 1847, the 2-story structure had weathered countless seasons, its white paint now faded to the color of old bones, its wraparound porch sagging slightly under the weight of time. Inside, the rooms echoed with memories of family dinners, holiday celebrations, and the warm laughter of his mother, who had passed when Thad was barely 16. His father, Samuel Reilly, had followed her to the grave just 6 months ago, leaving Thad alone with 500 acres, 30 head of cattle, and a mountain of debt that seemed to grow larger each month. The ranch deed sat in a wooden box on the kitchen table, yellowed with age and bearing the careful script of his grandfather's signature. This document represented more than land ownership. It was legacy, responsibility, and the weight of 3 generations of Reilly men who had worked this soil with their bare hands. Samuel had been a proud man, too proud to admit when the ranch was failing, too stubborn to ask for help when the cattle prices dropped and the creditors came calling. Now Thad faced the same pride, the same stubbornness, and the very real possibility that he might be the Reilly who lost it all. The house felt impossibly large and unbearably empty. Rooms that had once buzzed with family life now stood silent, gathering dust and memories. The kitchen table, built to seat 8, accommodated only Thad and his morning coffee. The parlor, where his mother had entertained the wives of neighboring ranchers, remained untouched, her embroidered cushions still arranged precisely as she had left them. Even his own bedroom felt hollow, the double bed his parents had shared now serving as a constant reminder of his solitary existence. 3 miles down the dusty road that connected the ranch to town lived the Keane family in a modest but well-kept farmhouse. Patrick Keane had worked as the town's blacksmith until arthritis bent his fingers into permanent claws, forcing him into early retirement. His wife, Margaret, took in sewing to make ends meet, her skilled fingers creating beautiful dresses for the town's more prosperous ladies. Their 3 daughters had been the pride of their lives, intelligent, beautiful, and raised with the kind of moral character that made mothers point them out as examples to their own children. Dinah, the eldest at 28, possessed a rare, combination of beauty and intellect that had made her the most sought-after woman in 3 counties. Her auburn hair caught the light like burnished copper, and her green eyes held depths that suggested both wisdom and wounded pride. She had been teaching school for 6 years, earning respect for her patience with difficult children and her ability to make even the most reluctant student love learning. Dinah carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who knew her own worth, never needing to prove anything to anyone. Her sisters, Mave and Norah, were equally remarkable in their own ways. Mave, 25, burned with the kind of fierce independence that made conventional society uncomfortable. Where Dinah was measured and thoughtful, Mave was quick-tempered and passionate, with flame-red hair that matched her temperament. She could ride better than most men, shoot straighter than the sheriff, and had opinions about everything from politics to the proper way to break a horse. Norah, the youngest at 23, possessed a gentle wisdom that belied her years. Quiet where Mave was loud, peaceful where Dinah was intense, Norah had inherited their mother's gift for seeing the best in people and situations that others might find hopeless. The 3 sisters shared an unbreakable bond, forged by years of facing the world together. When their father's arthritis ended his blacksmithing career, they had pooled their resources without discussion. When their mother's eyes began failing, from too many hours of close needlework, they had taken turns reading to her in the evenings. They were more than sisters. They were a unit, a small army that faced life's challenges shoulder to shoulder, which made the events of that terrible Saturday morning all the more shocking. Dinah's wedding to Harold Pemberton had been planned for months. Harold, a banker's son from the county seat, had courted her with the persistence of a man who always got what he wanted. He was handsome enough, wealthy enough, and respectable enough to satisfy even the most demanding parents. The wedding dress, ivory, silk with pearl buttons and hand-tatted lace, hung in the Keane parlor like a promise of happily ever after. The church had been decorated with wildflowers, the reception planned down to the last detail. At 10 o'clock that morning, with guests already gathered and the preacher checking his pocket watch, Harold Pemberton rode out of Prairie Bluff as if the devil himself were giving chase. He left behind only a hastily scribbled note claiming urgent business had called him away and that he would send word soon. The note, crumpled and tear-stained, now lay in the bottom of Margaret Keane's sewing basket, a monument to broken promises and shattered dreams. The humiliation had been complete and public. 200 wedding guests, including families from 3 counties, had witnessed Dinah's disgrace. The women whispered behind their gloved hands. The men shook their heads in sympathy, and the children stared with the brutal curiosity of youth. Dinah had stood at the altar in her beautiful dress, her face a mask of dignity, even as her world collapsed around her. When the preacher finally announced that the wedding was postponed, she had walked down that aisle with her head held high, her sisters flanking her like bodyguards. The town's reaction had been swift and divided. Some blamed Harold for his cowardice and poor timing. Others whispered that perhaps he had discovered something about Dinah that made him reconsider. The more charitable souls spoke of love's mysterious ways and expressed confidence that everything would work out for the best. But whispers, whether kind or cruel, still stung like prairie wind on an open wound. That was when Thad Reilly had stepped forward. He had been among the wedding guests, standing in the back of the church in his only good suit, a black wool garment that had belonged to his father. Thad rarely attended social functions, preferring the company of his cattle to the complexity of human relationships. But he had known the Keane family since childhood, had attended school with Dinah before his father pulled him out to work the ranch full-time. He respected Patrick Keane's craftsmanship and Margaret's kindness. More than that, he had harbored a quiet admiration for Dinah that he had never dared voice. Watching her walk down that aisle in defeat had stirred something fierce and protective in his chest. Without conscious thought, he had stepped into the center aisle, his voice carrying clearly through the shocked silence. "Miss Keane," he had said, his deep voice steady despite the thundering of his heart, "if you're willing, I would be honored to marry you today." The church had erupted in gasps and murmurs, but Thad's eyes had remained fixed on Dinah's face. For a long moment she had simply stared at him, this gentle giant who was offering salvation in the form of his name and protection. Then, with the same dignity that had carried her through the morning's humiliation, she had nodded once. "Yes, Mr. Reilly," she had said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. "I accept your proposal." The ceremony that followed had been brief and awkward but legally binding. The preacher, flustered but willing, had performed the service with the same words he had prepared for Harold and Dinah. The vows had been spoken quietly, respectfully, without the joy that should accompany such promises, but with a gravity that perhaps meant more. When Thad was instructed to kiss his bride, he had placed the gentlest of kisses on her forehead, a gesture of protection rather than passion. Now, 3 days later, Thad sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at that ranch deed and wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. Dinah had been grateful but distant, polite but reserved. She had taken over the household duties with quiet efficiency, preparing meals and tidying rooms without being asked. They had spoken of practical matters, her belongings still at her parents' house, the arrangement of living spaces, the expectations each held for this unusual marriage. What they had not discussed were the deeper questions that hung between them like morning mist. What did this marriage mean beyond mutual convenience? How long would she stay? What happened if Harold Pemberton returned with explanations and apologies? These questions lingered in the spaces between their careful conversations, in the careful distance Dinah maintained, in the way Thad found himself listening for her footsteps on the creaking floorboards. The ranch deed seemed to mock him from its place on the table. 3 generations of Reilly men had built something substantial here, something worth passing down. But what good was land without family to inherit it? What purpose did acres serve without children to run across them? Without a wife's laughter to fill the empty rooms? Outside, storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, promising the kind of sudden, violent weather that could change everything in a matter of minutes. Thad pushed back from the table and walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. Somewhere in town, Dinah was probably packing her belongings, preparing to begin a life she had never imagined. Tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, she would arrive with her trunk and her dignity intact, ready to fulfill her part of their unspoken bargain. He had married her out of kindness and perhaps a touch of foolish nobility. She had accepted him out of necessity and wounded pride. It was a practical arrangement that served both their needs. She gained respectability and security. He gained companionship and help with the ranch. Simple and straightforward. But as Thad watched the storm clouds building on the horizon, he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing about this arrangement would prove to be simple. The woman he had married was no ordinary woman, and the circumstances that had brought them together suggested that their story was far from over. In 3 days, Dinah Reilly would arrive at the ranch, and life as he knew it would change forever. The storm was coming, and Thad Reilly found himself both eager and terrified to see what it would bring. 3 days of careful politeness had established a rhythm between Thad and his new wife. Dinah rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, her movements efficient and quiet in the kitchen that had known only a bachelor's careless habits for months. Thad worked the ranch from sunrise to sunset, returning for meals and brief conversations about practical matters, the weather, the cattle, the small repairs the house needed. They shared the same roof, the same meals, the same last name, but remained as distant as strangers passing on a country road. Thad had insisted Dinah take the main bedroom, the room his parents had shared for 26 years. He had moved his few belongings to the small room off the kitchen that had once served as his father's study, sleeping on a narrow cot that left his long legs hanging over the edge. It was an arrangement born of respect and necessity, though it left both of them acutely aware of the boundaries they were carefully maintaining. On Wednesday morning, Thad was mending fence in the north pasture when he heard the sound of wagon, wheels grinding against the dirt road that led to the ranch house. He straightened, shading his eyes against the morning sun, and felt his stomach drop as he recognized the vehicle approaching his front door. The wagon was loaded high with trunks, boxes, and what appeared to be enough belongings for a small army. Driving the wagon was Mave Keane, her red hair blazing like a banner in the wind, her jaw set with the kind of determination that usually preceded trouble. Beside her sat Norah, serene as always, but with an apologetic expression that suggested she had tried and failed to talk her sister out of whatever plan had brought them here. In the back of the wagon, surrounded by their worldly possessions, sat their traveling trunk, a battered leather chest that had belonged to their grandmother and bore the scars of countless journeys. Thad dropped his hammer and strode toward the house, his mind racing. This was not part of the arrangement. Dinah had mentioned that her sisters would visit, of course, but this looked less like a visit and more like a permanent relocation. The quantity of belongings suggested they had packed up their entire lives, not just a few days' worth of clothing. He reached the front porch just as Dinah emerged from the house, her face a mixture of surprise, embarrassment, and something that might have been relief. The sisters had not announced their arrival, apparently, which meant this was as much a shock to her as it was to him. "Mave," Dinah said, her voice carefully controlled. "What are you doing here?" Mave jumped down from the wagon with characteristic lack of concern for ladylike behavior, her practical brown dress swirling around her boots. "We've come to stay," she announced, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "You didn't think we'd let you face this alone, did you?" "This is my marriage," Dinah replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "I need to what?" Mave interrupted, planting her hands on her hips. "Need to pretend you're happy and playing house with a stranger while the whole county whispers about what Harold Pemberton really discovered about you. Need to smile and nod while people speculate about why you were really abandoned at the altar." Thad winced at the bluntness of Mave's words, even as he recognized the loyalty behind them. Norah climbed down from the wagon more carefully, her gentle voice cutting through the tension. "What Mave means," she said, shooting her sister a reproving look, "is that we're family. We stick together no matter what. We've talked it over, and we've decided that if Dinah is going to make a new life here, then we're going to be part of it." Dinah's composure cracked slightly, her hand moving to her throat in a gesture Thad was beginning to recognize as a sign of distress. "You can't just... This isn't your decision to make. Mr. Reilly married me, not the entire Keane family." All three women turned to look at Thad, who suddenly felt like a deer caught in an open meadow with hunters closing in from all sides. This was exactly the kind of complex emotional situation he had hoped to avoid by remaining a bachelor. He understood cattle, weather, and the honest work of ranching. He did not understand the intricate dynamics of sisters, the unspoken rules that governed their relationships, or how to navigate the choppy waters of family loyalty. He began, then stopped, realizing that whatever he said next would determine the course of his immediate future. If he supported Dinah's position, he would be asking two young women to return to a town where their sister's disgrace had touched them all. If he welcomed the sisters, he would be inviting complications into an arrangement that was already more complex than he had anticipated. Mave stepped forward, her green eyes, so like Dinah's but fiercer, meeting his without flinching. "Mr. Reilly, I know this isn't what you bargained for, but we're not asking for charity. We can work. I can cook, clean, help with the ranch work if needed. Norah can manage household accounts, tend a garden, care for animals. We're not dead weight. And we won't stay forever," Norah added quietly. "Just until we're all settled, until we know Dinah is—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Until we know she's safe," Mave finished bluntly. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Safe from what? From him? From the gossip? From the possibility that this marriage was a mistake that would leave her worse off than before? Thad felt a flash of something that might have been hurt, though he couldn't say he blamed them for their caution. He was, as Mave had pointed out, essentially a stranger who had married their sister in a moment of impulse. "How long?" he asked. Finally, his deep voice cutting through the morning air. The sisters exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was Dinah who answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," she admitted. "They're my sisters. I can't just turn them away." Thad looked at the wagon full of belongings, at the 3 women who stood before him like a united front, at the house that had felt too big for one person and would now be filled to bursting with feminine voices and presence. He thought of his father, who had valued family above all else, who had often said that a man's worth was measured not by what he accumulated, but by how well he protected those who depended on him. "The house has 4 bedrooms, he said slowly. 2 downstairs, 2 upstairs. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." The relief on all 3 faces was immediate and unmistakable. Mave's militant stance softened, Norah's worried expression eased, and Dinah's shoulders relaxed as if a weight had been lifted from them. "Thank you," Dinah said softly, and for the first time since their wedding, she looked at him with something approaching warmth. The rest of the morning was a whirlwind of activity. The sisters unpacked with the efficiency of people accustomed to making quick domestic arrangements. Mave claimed the smaller upstairs bedroom, declaring it perfect for someone who didn't need much space. Norah took the larger upstairs room, explaining that she had brought her sewing machine and would need room to work. Their grandmother's traveling trunk was placed in the parlor, where it seemed to anchor the room with its solid, practical presence. By noon, the Reilly ranch house had been transformed. The kitchen, which had echoed with emptiness for months, now bustled with activity as Mave prepared the kind of substantial meal the house hadn't seen since Thad's mother had died. Norah arranged wildflowers in mason jars, adding splashes of color to rooms that had grown gray with neglect. Dinah moved through it all with quiet purpose, directing the placement of belongings and mediating the occasional disagreement between her sisters. Thad found himself relegated to the periphery of this domestic reorganization, his role reduced to lifting heavy items and answering questions about where things might be stored. It was not an unpleasant feeling exactly, but it was profoundly disorienting. His house, his space, his carefully ordered bachelor existence had been upended in the span of a single morning. That evening, as they sat down to their first dinner as an unlikely family of 4, Thad surveyed the scene with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. The long table that had seated only him for months now accommodated 4 place settings. Conversation flowed around him. Discussions of household arrangements, plans for improving the garden, suggestions for small repairs that would make the house more comfortable. "Mr. Reilly," Norah said during a lull in the conversation, her gentle voice drawing his attention, "we truly appreciate your kindness. I hope you know that we don't take it lightly." "It's just Thad," he replied, feeling awkward with the formality. "And this is your home now, for as long as you need it to be." As the words left his mouth, he realized they were true. Whatever arrangement he had envisioned when he married Dinah, some quiet, simple partnership that would solve both their problems, was now impossible. His life had become infinitely more complicated, filled with the voices, needs, and expectations of 3 women who came as a package deal. Later that night, as he lay on his narrow cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house full of people, Thad stared at the ceiling and wondered what he had gotten himself into. Above him, he could hear soft voices as the sisters talked late into the night, probably discussing their new situation, their new home, their unusual brother-in-law. The traveling trunk in the parlor seemed to represent everything his simple plan had not accounted for. The bonds of family, the complexity of women's relationships, the reality that people come with histories, loyalties and connections that cannot be severed by convenience. He had married one woman and gained three. He had sought a quiet partnership and found himself the head of a household that buzzed with feminine energy and purpose. As sleep finally began to claim him, Thad's last conscious thought was that his house had never felt more alive, or his future more uncertain. The first week of their expanded household passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Thad quickly learned that living with three women was nothing like the quiet, predictable existence he had known as a bachelor. The house hummed with constant activity. Conversations that flowed from room to room, the rustle of skirts on wooden floors, the gentle chaos of shared domestic life. Mave had claimed the kitchen as her domain with the territorial instinct of a general securing strategic ground. From their mother's recipe box, a worn wooden container filled with cards written in Margaret Keane's careful script, she produced meals that transformed the simple act of eating into something approaching ceremony. Where Thad had subsisted on beans, bacon, and whatever he could quickly prepare between ranch work, Mave created hearty stews fragrant with herbs, fresh bread that filled the house with its warm aroma, and pies that made him understand why men fought wars over such things. "Food is love made visible," she declared on their third morning together, as she set before him a breakfast of eggs, thick-cut bacon, fried potatoes, and biscuits that melted in his mouth. "Mama always said a family that eats well together stays." Together, the meals became the anchor points of their days, gathering them around the long kitchen table that had sat largely empty for too long. Conversation flowed as naturally as coffee from the pot, though Thad noticed that certain topics were carefully avoided. No one mentioned Harold Pemberton. No one speculated about the future. No one questioned the unusual nature of their arrangement. Instead, they talked of small things: the weather, plans for the garden, stories from their childhood that painted pictures of the Keane family's warmth and closeness. Norah brought her own gentle efficiency to the household, her quiet observations, solving problems before anyone else noticed they existed. She discovered that the pump in the kitchen sink could be fixed with a simple adjustment of the leather gasket. She noticed that the parlor windows faced east and would be perfect for starting seedlings. She suggested rearranging the furniture in the front room to better accommodate conversation, creating a more welcoming space than the formal museum-like arrangement Thad's mother had favored. "You have good instincts for this place," Thad told her one evening as she repaired a torn curtain with neat, invisible stitches. "It's like you can see what it needs." Norah smiled, her needle never pausing in its work. "Every home has its own personality. You just have to listen to what it's telling you." Dinah's presence in the house was more subtle, but no less significant. She had taken over the ranch's bookkeeping, her teacher's precision bringing order to the chaos of receipts, bills, and ledgers that Thad had neglected since his father's death. Her handwriting transformed the messy columns of numbers into neat, comprehensible records that revealed both the ranch's problems and its potential. "You're not as bad off as you think," she told him one afternoon, spreading the ledgers across the kitchen table while Mave prepared dinner. "The debt is substantial, but it's manageable if we're careful. The cattle prices should improve in the fall, and if we can increase the herd size—" Thad interrupted gently. Dinah paused, her pen hovering over the page, a flush creeping up her neck. "I meant, that is, if you decide to—" She stopped, clearly flustered by her unconscious assumption that she would be part of long-term planning. "No," Thad said quickly. "You're right. I appreciate the help more than you know." The moment passed, but it left something hanging in the air between them, a recognition that despite the practical nature of their arrangement, they were beginning to think of themselves as partners in more than just name. Their sleeping arrangements remained awkward but functional. Thad continued to occupy the small room off the kitchen, though he had invested in a longer cot that didn't leave his feet hanging over the edge. The sisters shared the upstairs, their voices drifting down in the evenings as they talked, laughed, and went about the intimate business of being family. Sometimes Thad caught himself listening to those voices, particularly Dinah's, and wondering what it would be like to be included in that circle of warmth and belonging. The physical proximity created moments of unexpected intimacy. Dinah might brush against him as she reached for something in the kitchen, her skirt swishing against his legs. Mave would pat his shoulder approvingly when he complimented her cooking. Norah would touch his arm gently when she wanted his attention. These casual contacts, so normal between family members, felt charged with significance to a man who had lived alone for months. It was during their second week together that the first real test of their arrangement arrived in the form of visitors. Thad was replacing boards on the front porch when he saw a familiar buggy approaching from town. His stomach tightened as he recognized Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, and Mrs. Cunningham, who owned the general store. These women were the unofficial authorities on social propriety in Prairie Bluff, and their visit could only mean one thing. They had come to inspect the scandalous household and render judgment. "Ladies," Thad said, tipping his hat as they climbed the porch steps, "what brings you out this way?" Mrs. Abernathy, a thin woman with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, surveyed the scene with obvious disapproval. "We've come to call on your wife, Mr. Reilly. It's only proper given the circumstances." Before Thad could respond, Dinah appeared. In the doorway, her posture straight and dignified despite the simple work dress she wore. Behind her, Mave and Norah flanked her like guards, their presence making it clear that any judgment of Dinah would have to go through them first. "Mrs. Abernathy, Mrs. Cunningham," Dinah said with perfect politeness, "how kind of you to visit. Please come in." The next hour was a masterclass in social warfare, conducted with teacups and careful conversation. The visitors probed delicately, but persistently. How was Dinah adjusting to married life? Were the sisters planning to stay long? Wasn't it unusual for newlyweds to have so much company? Mave answered their questions with barely concealed hostility, her responses technically polite but edged with warning. Norah deflected with gentle humor and offers of more tea. Dinah maintained perfect composure, neither apologizing for their arrangement nor offering explanations that weren't owed. It was Thad who finally ended the inquisition, appearing in the parlor doorway with mud on his boots and work gloves in. His hands. "Ladies," he said in his deep, calm voice, "I hope you'll forgive me, but I need to borrow my wife for a moment. There's something about the cattle that requires her attention." The visitors looked startled. Cattle were hardly a woman's concern, and certainly not something that would require interrupting a social call. But Thad's tone brooked no argument, and Dinah rose immediately, understanding the rescue he was offering. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Mrs. Abernathy, Mrs. Cunningham, thank you so much for coming. Please give my regards to your families." After the buggy disappeared down the road, the four of them stood on the porch in companionable silence. Finally, Mave spoke. "Well, that was unpleasant," she said with characteristic bluntness. "But necessary," Norah added. "Now they can report back to town that we're all perfectly respectable." Dinah turned to Thad, something like gratitude shining in her green eyes. "Thank you for the rescue." "Any time," he replied, and meant it. "This is your home. You don't owe anyone explanations for how you choose to live in it." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing Mave's beef stew and fresh cornbread, Thad realized something had shifted. The careful politeness that had characterized their first weeks together was giving way to something more comfortable, more genuine. They were becoming, despite the unusual circumstances, something that resembled a family. As Mave's laughter filled the kitchen, and Norah's gentle voice shared a story from their childhood, Thad caught Dinah watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. When their eyes met, she didn't look away immediately as she had before. Instead, she offered him a small smile that seemed to acknowledge what they were building together. This unlikely household, this unexpected sense of belonging, this fragile, but growing thing that might, with time and care, become something beautiful. By the end of their first month together, the rhythm of their shared life had settled into something that felt natural, even comfortable. The ranch work had intensified with the approach of summer, and Thad found himself grateful for the extra hands, even if they came in the form of skirts and determination rather than the hired help he had originally envisioned. Dinah had surprised him most of all. The refined schoolteacher, who had once seemed too delicate for ranch life, proved to have a core of steel and a willingness to learn that impressed him daily. She insisted on understanding every aspect of the ranch's operation, from the financial records to the practical work of cattle management. His father's old work gloves, worn smooth by decades of honest labor, now fit her hands as she learned to mend fences, check water troughs, and handle the gentler cattle with growing confidence. "Your hands are getting calloused," he observed one afternoon as she helped him move a section of the herd to fresh pasture. They stood side by side, watching the cattle settle into their new grazing area, and he had noticed her unconsciously rubbing her palms. "Good," she replied firmly. "Soft hands are a luxury I can't afford anymore." There was something in her tone that made him look at her more closely. Dinah had changed over the past weeks, becoming less the displaced bride and more the determined partner. The pale, shocked woman who had walked down the church aisle in defeat was transforming into someone stronger, more grounded. Ranch life was leaving its mark on her in ways beyond just calloused hands. Her complexion had gained color from the prairie sun, her posture had strengthened from physical work, and her eyes held a confidence that hadn't been there on there. "A wedding day. You don't have to prove anything," he said gently. "To me or to anyone else, don't I?" She turned to face him fully, her green eyes serious. "I was abandoned at the altar, Thad. The whole county thinks there must be something wrong with me, something Harold discovered that made him run. Every time I go to town, I can feel people watching, wondering, speculating about what secret flaw I must be hiding." It was the first time she had spoken Harold's name since their wedding, the first time she had acknowledged the pain and humiliation that had driven her to accept Thad's proposal. Her honesty created an intimacy between them that felt more significant than their marriage vows. "There's nothing wrong with you," Thad said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Harold Pemberton is a fool who doesn't deserve 5 minutes of your thoughts." The intensity in his voice surprised them both. Dinah studied his face, searching for something in his expression, and Thad felt exposed under her scrutiny. He had revealed more than he intended, allowed his growing feelings to color his words in ways that went beyond mere kindness. "Is that what you really think?" she asked quietly. "I think," Thad said carefully, "that any man who had the chance to marry you and chose to run instead is the biggest fool this side of the Mississippi." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Dinah's lips parted slightly, as if she might say something important, something that would change the careful balance they had maintained. But before she could speak, Mave's voice rang out across the pasture, calling them back to the house for supper. The spell broke, and they walked back together in a silence that felt different from the comfortable quiet they had shared before. Something had shifted. Some boundary had been crossed, and both of them seemed to sense that their relationship was entering new territory. Mave had announced her intention to find work in town, declaring herself tired of being dependent on anyone's charity, even family charity. Her fierce independence had always chafed at situations where she wasn't earning her own way, and despite Thad's assurances that her contributions to the household were valuable, she insisted on seeking paid employment. "I'm not charity," she declared over breakfast one morning, her red hair crackling with determination. "I'm perfectly capable of supporting myself." "No one said you weren't," Norah replied mildly, though her eyes held a familiar worry. The sisters' bond meant that Mave's struggles affected them all. "Mrs. Henderson at the general store needs help," Mave continued, ignoring the concern in her sister's voice. "She's getting on in years, and her arthritis makes it hard for her to manage the inventory. I could work there 3 days a week and still help here on the ranch." Thad set down his coffee cup, recognizing the stubborn set of Mave's jaw that meant argument would be futile. "If that's what you want," he said simply. "It is." Mave's voice softened slightly. "I appreciate everything you've done for us, Thad. But I need to know I can take care of myself." Norah's situation was different, but equally significant. Thomas Morrison, the son of a neighboring rancher, had begun calling on her with increasing frequency. He was a quiet, steady young man who seemed genuinely smitten with Norah's gentle nature and practical wisdom. Their courtship was conducted with old-fashioned propriety, afternoon visits in the parlor, chaperoned walks, and conversations that revealed a growing mutual affection. "He's asked me to the church social next Saturday," Norah confided to Dinah one evening as they prepared dinner together. I think he might be serious about his intentions." Dinah smiled, though Thad caught a flicker of something that might have been concern. "Do you care for him?" "I do," Norah admitted, her cheeks pink with pleasure. "He's kind and hard-working, and he makes me laugh. But you're worried about leaving me," Dinah finished, her voice understanding. "We've never been apart," Norah said simply. "Not really. The idea of making a life somewhere else, of not seeing you every day, that's what's supposed to happen," Dinah replied firmly. "We're supposed to grow up, fall in love, make our own families. I won't have you limiting your happiness for my sake." Watching this exchange from the kitchen doorway, Thad felt a complex mix of emotions. The sisters' bond was beautiful, but complicated. Their loyalty to each other both a strength and a potential barrier to their individual happiness. He found himself wondering what would happen if Norah married and moved away. If Mave found her independence in town, would Dinah feel abandoned again? Would their fragile household dissolve as quickly as it had formed? More troubling was his realization that the thought of Dinah leaving, returning to her parents perhaps, or accepting some other offer of marriage, filled him with something approaching panic. When had she stopped being a convenient arrangement and started being essential to his vision of the future? That night, as he lay on his cot, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around him, Thad confronted the truth he had been avoiding. He was falling in love with his wife, not the grateful, respectful affection he had expected from their practical arrangement, but something deeper and more dangerous. He wanted her to stay, not because she needed his protection, but because he needed her presence. He wanted to share not just his name and his house, but his thoughts, his dreams, his bed. The realization terrified him. Their marriage was built on mutual necessity, not love. Dinah had accepted his proposal because she had no other choice, not because she desired him. If he allowed his feelings to become obvious, he might destroy the comfortable partnership they had built. He might drive her away just as surely as Harold Pemberton had, though for different reasons. But as he drifted towards sleep, Thad couldn't escape the memory of how Dinah had looked at him that afternoon in the pasture, the way her eyes had searched his face when he called Harold a fool. There had been something there, some flicker of possibility that suggested his feelings might not be entirely one-sided. The question was whether he was brave enough to find out. 2 months into their unconventional arrangement, the seasons began their slow turn toward autumn, bringing with them a sense of permanence that surprised everyone in the household. What had begun as a temporary solution was taking on the solid weight of established routine, of lives genuinely intertwined rather than merely coexisting. The family Bible, a massive leather-bound volume that had belonged to Thad's grandmother, sat prominently on the mantelpiece in the parlor. Inside its worn pages, alongside generations of Reilly family records, Thad had carefully written the date of his marriage to Dinah. The entry looked official, permanent, though he sometimes wondered if Dinah saw it the same way. The sacred nature of the vows they had spoken seemed to matter less than the practical benefits their union provided. Yet lately, he found himself thinking more about the promises they had made before God and community. Mave had settled into her work at Henderson's general store with characteristic efficiency and growing popularity among the customers. Her directness, which had sometimes seemed abrasive in social situations, proved to be exactly what people wanted when making purchases. She could recommend the best fabric for a work shirt, suggest solutions for household problems, and manage inventory with the precision of a military quartermaster. Mrs. Henderson, initially skeptical about hiring one of those Keane girls, now declared Mave indispensable. "I don't know what I did without her," the elderly store owner confided to anyone who would listen. "That girl has more sense in her little finger than most people have in their whole bodies." The steady income from Mave's work, combined with the improving ranch finances under Dinah's careful management, had begun to ease the financial pressure that had weighed on Thad since his father's death. For the first time in months, he could sleep without worrying about the next mortgage payment or whether they could afford to buy feed for the cattle through the winter. Norah's courtship with Thomas Morrison had progressed with the stately pace of a formal dance. He called on her twice a week, bringing small gifts, wildflowers, a book of poetry, a hair ribbon from the store in the county seat. Their conversations, conducted under the watchful but approving eyes of her sisters and Thad, revealed a compatibility that went beyond mere attraction. They shared similar values, complementary temperaments, and the kind of quiet understanding that suggested a stable foundation for marriage. "He's going to propose soon," Norah confided to Dinah one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. "I can see it in his eyes, the way he gets nervous when we're alone, how he keeps touching his jacket pocket like there's something important inside." Dinah smiled, though her expression held layers of emotion that Norah seemed to miss. "Are you ready to say yes?" "I think so," Norah replied softly. "I love him and I believe he loves me. His family has accepted me, and his ranch is prospering. We could have a good life together." "But," Dinah prompted, sensing hesitation in her sister's voice. "But it means leaving you," Norah said simply. "Leaving this house, this family we've built. Mave will have her independence, you'll have your marriage, and I'll be somewhere else." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of unspoken fears and unacknowledged truths. The sisters had been each other's primary source of support and companionship for their entire lives. The prospect of genuine separation, of building lives with other people, was both exciting and terrifying. From inside the house came the sound of Thad and Mave discussing plans for expanding the chicken coop, their voices mixing in easy conversation. It was a sound that had become as familiar as the prairie wind, a soundtrack to their daily lives that Dinah had come to treasure. "This is a good place," Norah observed, her gaze encompassing the ranch, the house, the life they had all built. "Together. You've found something real here, haven't you?" Dinah's hands tightened on the porch railing, her knuckles showing white in the fading light. "I don't know what I've found," she admitted. "It's not what any of us expected, but it's home," Norah finished gently. The word hung between them, loaded with meaning. Home was more than a place. It was a feeling of belonging, of safety, of being valued for who you truly were. In the 2 months since arriving at the Reilly Ranch, all three sisters had found something they hadn't even realized they were seeking. That night, Dinah found herself unable to sleep, her mind churning with thoughts about the future, about the changes that seemed to be accelerating around them. She rose quietly and made her way to the kitchen, thinking to make tea and perhaps read for a while until sleep became possible. She found Thad there before her, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a pile of papers spread before him. He looked up as she entered, his eyes crinkling with the soft smile that had become increasingly familiar. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Too many thoughts," she replied, settling into the chair and noting how natural it felt to share this quiet midnight space with him. "What about you?" "Planning," he said, indicating the papers. Thinking about next year, about improvements we could make, investments that might pay off. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. Assuming, of course, that we're all still here next year. The question in his voice was carefully neutral, but Dinah caught the uncertainty beneath it. He was asking about her plans, her intentions, whether she saw their arrangement as temporary or permanent. It was a conversation they had been dancing around for weeks, neither willing to broach the subject directly for fear of the answer. Where else would I be? She asked, surprised by her own certainty. You could return to teaching, Thad said carefully. I heard Mrs. Patterson is retiring next year. The school board would welcome you back in a heartbeat. Would you want me to go back to teaching? The question escaped before she could stop it, revealing more vulnerability than she had intended. I want you to be happy, Thad replied, his voice rough with sincerity. I want you to have the life you choose, not the one circumstances forced on you. Dinah studied his face in the lamplight, noting the honesty in his expression, the careful way he was trying to give her permission to leave if that's what she wanted. But she was beginning to understand that what she wanted and what she had thought she wanted might be two very different things. What if, she said slowly, what if the life circumstances forced on me turned out to be better than the one I had planned? Thad's hand stilled on his coffee cup, his brown eyes searching her face. What do you mean? I mean, Dinah continued, feeling as if she were stepping off a cliff into unknown territory, that maybe Harold Pemberton did me the greatest favor of my life when he ran away. Maybe this, she gestured to encompass the kitchen, the house, the life they had built together. Maybe this is what I was supposed to find. The silence that followed was charged with possibility. Thad leaned forward slightly, his large hands spread flat on the table between them. Dinah, he said, her name a whisper in the lamplight. I need you to know that what started as kindness has become something else entirely. These past 2 months, watching you become part of this place, part of my life, I know, she interrupted softly, for me too. They sat in the golden circle of lamplight, the rest of the house quiet around them, and acknowledged what had been growing between them since that first evening when she had helped him with the ranch accounts. Somewhere in the midst of shared meals, common work, and gentle conversations, convenience had transformed into affection, and affection was becoming something deeper and more precious. So what do we do now? Thad asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We take it one day at a time, Dinah replied, reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers. We see where this takes us. Their fingers intertwined on the scarred wooden table, and for the first time since their wedding day, the future felt like something to anticipate rather than simply endure. 3 months into their marriage, Dinah received an envelope that would force her to examine everything she thought she knew about her new life. The teaching certificate she had earned 6 years ago arrived in the mail, renewed and updated by the State Education Board without her request. Along with it came a formal letter from the Prairie Bluff School Board, offering her the position of head teacher for the upcoming school year. The certificate lay on the kitchen table like a bridge between two worlds, the life she had lived before her wedding day, humiliation, and the life she was building at the ranch. The elegant script declaring her qualified to educate the children of Kansas seemed to mock the calloused hands that now handled cattle and mended fences as easily as they had once held chalk and graded papers. You should take it, Mave declared, reading over Dinah's shoulder. Teaching is what you were born to do. You have a gift for it. But what about the ranch? Dinah asked, her eyes finding Thad's across the table. The bookkeeping, the household, we managed before you came, Thad said quietly, though his voice held a tension that suggested the words cost him effort. We could manage again. It was the right thing to say, the honorable response that gave her complete freedom to choose. But Dinah found herself wishing he had fought for her to stay, had declared that he needed her here, that the ranch couldn't function without her contributions. Instead, he was being the gentleman he had always been, putting her desires above. His own needs. The money would be good, Norah observed practically. Teachers earn a steady salary and you'd have your independence. Independence. The word that had once seemed so appealing now felt cold and isolating. Dinah thought of her mornings working alongside Thad, of the satisfaction she felt when the account books balanced perfectly, of the way he had begun asking her opinion on ranch decisions. Was independence worth giving up the partnership they had built? "I need time to think," she said finally, folding the letter carefully. That evening, Thad found her sitting on the front porch, staring out at the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The sun was setting behind them, casting long shadows across the grassland and painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. He settled beside her on the porch swing his father had built years ago, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "Regrets?" he asked simply. "About what?" "About this." He gestured to encompass the ranch, their life together. "About choosing this instead of waiting for something else." Dinah considered the question seriously, as she always did when Thad asked something important. "No," she said finally, "no regrets about this. But I keep wondering, what if Harold had stayed? What if he had married me as planned? Would I have been happy? Would you?" Thad's voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the tension beneath his calm exterior. "I thought so at the time," Dinah admitted. "Harold represented security, respectability, a comfortable life. But now I realize that comfortable and happy aren't the same thing." They sat in silence for a moment, the evening breeze carrying the scent of prairie grass and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Dinah had grown to love these quiet moments, when the work of the day was done and they could simply exist together without the need for conversation or activity. "What would make you happy?" Thad asked, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. "This," Dinah said without hesitation. "This house, this land, this life we're building, the ranch work, the account books, the feeling that I'm contributing to something meaningful." She paused, then added more quietly, "You." Thad turned to look at her, his brown eyes serious in the fading light. "Dinah, I know it's not what we agreed to," she continued quickly, afraid that if she stopped speaking she might lose her courage. "I know this was supposed to be a practical arrangement, a marriage of convenience. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being convenient and started being real," Thad finished, his hand covering hers on the swing's armrest. "Yes, real." They sat in the peaceful evening air, hands intertwined, acknowledging what had been growing between them for weeks. The teaching position lay forgotten on the kitchen table, less important than this moment of honesty, this recognition of what they had found together. "The school board can find another teacher," Dinah said finally, "but I don't want to find another life." Thad's smile was slow and warm, transforming his serious face into something that made her heart skip. "Are you sure? Teaching is important work. You're good at it." "I'm good at this too," Dinah replied, gesturing toward the ranch, "and this feels like where I belong." "Then stay," Thad said simply. "Stay, and let's see what we can build together." That night Mave announced her own news during dinner. She had been offered a partnership stake in Henderson's General Store, a chance to buy into the business and eventually take it over when Mrs. Henderson retired. "She says I have a head for business and a way with people," Mave explained, her green eyes bright with excitement. "It would mean staying in Prairie Bluff permanently, making this my home, instead of just a temporary stop." "That's wonderful," Dinah said, genuinely pleased for her sister's opportunity. "It means we're all putting down roots," Norah observed, with a smile. "Mave in town, me with Thomas, and you here at the ranch." The next morning brought Thomas Morrison to the front door, hat in hand and nervous energy radiating from every line of his body. He asked to speak with Thad privately, a request that could only mean one thing. Dinah and her sisters watched from the kitchen window as the two men walked toward the barn, deep in conversation. "He's asking for permission to court me properly," Norah said, her cheeks pink with pleasure. Father's been gone too long for traditional protocol, so Thad is the closest thing to a male family head we have." When the men returned to the house, Thomas's face was bright with relief, and Thad's expression was warmly approving. The formal request had been made and granted, clearing the way for a proposal that everyone knew was coming: another wedding. In the family, Mave observed with satisfaction, though this one should go more smoothly than the last. As autumn deepened and the first frost touched the prairie grass, the 4 residents of the Reilly Ranch settled into their new roles with the satisfaction of people who had found their proper places in the world. Dinah declined the teaching position in a letter that thanked the school board, but firmly stated her intention to remain at the ranch. Mave signed papers, making her a junior partner in the general store. Norah began planning a Christmas wedding. To Thomas Morrison, and Thad and Dinah, finally honest about their feelings, began the careful process of transforming their marriage of convenience into something deeper, more lasting, and infinitely more precious than either had dared to hope. For the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, delivered by a rider who refused refreshment and left immediately after placing the official-looking envelope in Thad's hands. The return address bore the seal of the Territorial Land Office, and inside were documents that would shatter the peaceful existence they had all come to treasure. Land survey documents, detailed and official, revealed that the Reilly Ranch sat atop one of the richest mineral deposits in the territory. Coal, iron ore, and traces of precious metals lay beneath the grassland that 3 generations of Reillys had used for cattle grazing, unaware of the fortune that slept in the earth below their feet. The surveys had been conducted secretly over the past year, part of a territorial expansion project that was mapping resources for future development. "This can't be right," Thad said, spreading the papers across the kitchen table where they had shared so many peaceful meals. "Father would have known, someone would have told us." But the documents were authentic, bearing official seals and signatures that left no room for doubt. The ranch wasn't just valuable farmland, it was sitting on what the survey estimated to be hundreds of thousands of dollars in extractable resources. The kind of wealth that could transform a struggling cattle operation into a mining empire, that could elevate a simple rancher into one of the territory's most prosperous men. The discovery might have been cause for celebration, but what followed in the mail over the next 3 days turned their potential fortune into a nightmare. First came the letter from Harold Pemberton, written in his familiar, precise handwriting and bearing a postmark from Denver. "My dear Dinah," it began, with the casual presumption that had always characterized Harold's approach to their relationship. "I have recently learned of developments regarding your current living situation that compel me to write. I know my departure on our wedding day was abrupt and inexplicable, and I owe you the fullest explanation." The letter went on to detail Harold's discovery, through banking connections, of the potential mineral wealth on the Reilly Ranch. His sudden departure had not been caused by cold feet or discovered flaws in Dinah's character, as the gossips had speculated. Instead, he had learned of the preliminary surveys and had spent the past months in Denver, consulting with mining engineers and territorial officials about the legal implications of the discovery. "The original marriage contract between us," Harold's letter continued, "included provisions regarding property rights that would have given me legal claim to any assets you brought into the marriage. Given the territorial laws regarding mineral rights and spousal property, I believe a strong case can be made that our intended union created a legal precedent that supersedes your subsequent arrangements." The letter concluded with Harold's announcement that he would be returning to Prairie Bluff within the week, accompanied by lawyers and prepared to rectify the unfortunate misunderstanding that had separated them. Dinah's hands shook as she read the letter aloud to the assembled family. The words felt like a physical assault, each sentence stripping away the security and happiness they had built together. Harold was claiming that their broken engagement gave him rights to the ranch's newfound wealth, that their unconsummated Wedding had created legal obligations that overrode her marriage to Thad. "He can't do this," Mave said fiercely, her green eyes blazing with protective fury. "You're married to Thad now. Harold abandoned you. He has no claim on anything." But worse news was yet to come. The next day brought representatives from the Great Western Railroad Company, well-dressed men with official documents and barely concealed threats. They wanted to purchase the ranch outright, offering a sum that seemed enormous until they revealed that they knew about the mineral surveys. Their offer was a fraction of the land's true value, and their manner suggested that refusal might not be a viable option. "We understand this is unexpected," the lead representative, a thin man named Carver, said as he sat in their parlor sipping tea as if he owned the place. "But the railroad's expansion through this territory is inevitable. Progress waits for no one, Mr. Reilly. You can either be part of it willingly, or you can find yourself swept aside by forces larger than yourself." The threat was politely worded, but unmistakable. The railroad wanted the mineral rights, and they had the political connections and financial resources to take what they wanted through legal means if necessary. They spoke of eminent domain, of territorial development projects that served the greater good, of compensation that would be far less generous if the matter had to be decided by territorial courts. "How long do we have to consider your offer?" Thad asked, his voice steady, despite the storm raging behind his calm exterior. "1 week, Carver replied, standing to leave. "We're reasonable men, Mr. Reilly, but our patience has limits. Don't mistake our courtesy for weakness." After the railroad men left, the family sat in stunned silence around the kitchen table. The documents spread before them told a story of greed, manipulation, and legal complexities that none of them fully understood. Harold's broken engagement had apparently been carefully calculated. His abandonment of Dinah, a strategic move designed to position himself for maximum advantage when the mineral wealth was discovered. "He knew," Dinah said, her voice hollow with realization. "Harold knew about the surveys before our wedding day. That's why he left. Not because he discovered something wrong with me, but because he needed time to research the legal implications, to find a way to claim the mineral rights, without actually having to marry me." The betrayal was complete and devastating. Harold hadn't abandoned her out of fear or discovered incompatibility. He had abandoned her as part of a calculated plan to steal a fortune, using their broken engagement as a legal weapon to claim wealth that belonged to her husband. "The marriage contract," Norah said quietly, her gentle voice cutting through the angry voices of her sisters. Harold mentioned a marriage contract. What did it say exactly? Dinah's parents had kept a copy of the contract, and when Margaret Keane brought it to the ranch that evening, its contents confirmed their worst fears. The document, standard for marriages involving property, included clauses that gave the husband rights to any assets the wife might inherit or acquire during their marriage. Territorial law was unclear about whether an abandoned engagement might still create binding obligations, especially when substantial wealth was involved. "We need a lawyer," Thad said grimly, studying the contract by lamplight. "Someone who understands territorial law and mineral rights. But lawyers cost money they didn't have, and time they couldn't afford. Harold would arrive within days, armed with legal documents and mining experts. The railroad company had given them 1 week to accept their lowball offer. The territorial courts were notoriously slow and often favored outside investors over local ranchers. "There's something else," Margaret Keane said hesitantly, producing another document from her sewing basket. "Something Harold left behind that we didn't understand at the time." The paper was a preliminary mining claim, filed in Harold's name just 2 days before their scheduled wedding. It claimed mineral rights to the Reilly Ranch based on his forthcoming marriage to Dinah Keane, establishing his legal intent to profit from the mineral wealth even before their union was consummated. The evidence of Harold's calculated betrayal was overwhelming. He had known about the surveys, had filed mining claims, had abandoned Dinah not out of fear but out of greed. Now he was returning to claim a fortune based on a broken promise and a marriage contract that had never been fulfilled. As the family absorbed this final revelation, they realized that their peaceful existence was about to become a battlefield. Harold Pemberton was coming back to Prairie Bluff, and he was bringing lawyers, mining experts, and the full weight of territorial law to steal everything they had built together. The question now was whether their love, their unity, and their determination would be enough to fight forces that seemed insurmountable. The ranch that had become their sanctuary was about to become the prize in a legal war that would test every bond they had forged and every promise they had made to each other. The wedding ring set that had belonged to Thad's grandmother lay open on the kitchen table. Two simple gold bands that had once symbolized eternal love and were now evidence in a legal battle that threatened to destroy everything they held dear. Thad had given Dinah only a temporary ring during their hasty ceremony, his mother's engagement ring, hastily resized. But these rings represented something deeper. They were the symbol of choice, of commitment freely given rather than circumstances imposed. "We need to make this marriage unquestionably real," said Benjamin Hartwell, the lawyer they had finally managed to hire with the last of their savings. A young man fresh from law school in Chicago, he was the only attorney willing to take their case against the combined forces of Harold Pemberton and the railroad company. "The marriage contract Harold is using as leverage assumes that your engagement to him created binding obligations. We need to prove that your marriage to Mr. Reilly supersedes any previous arrangements." Hartwell spread legal documents across the table with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to fighting battles with paperwork. The territorial courts recognize three elements that make a marriage legally unassailable: witnessed vows, consummation, and community recognition. You have the first and third, but Harold's lawyers will argue that the marriage was one of convenience only, never properly consummated, and therefore invalid under territorial statutes. The implication hung in the air between them. Dinah's cheeks flushed, but she met the lawyer's gaze steadily. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Hartwell?" "I'm suggesting that you and Mr. Reilly need to be prepared to testify, under oath, that this is a complete marriage in every sense. Harold's case depends on proving that your union was merely a business arrangement, that you never intended to be truly married. If the court believes that, they might rule that your original engagement contract takes precedence." Thad's large hands clenched on the table. "How is any of this legal? A man abandons his bride at the altar, disappears for months, and then returns to claim her property. What kind of law allows that?" "Territorial law," Hartwell replied grimly. "It's designed to encourage development and investment, often at the expense of individual property rights. Harold has hired lawyers from Denver who specialize in mineral rights cases. They're arguing that his original marriage contract established his intent to develop the land's resources, and that your marriage to Mrs. Reilly was a deliberate attempt to circumvent legitimate mining claims. The legal complexities were overwhelming, but the human cost was devastating. Harold's return to Prairie Bluff had divided the community down the middle. Some residents, particularly those who stood to profit from railroad development, supported his claim. Others, who had witnessed Dinah's humiliation and Thad's nobility, rallied behind the couple they had come to respect. Mrs. Abernathy stopped. "Me in town yesterday," Mave reported during one of their nightly strategy sessions. "She said the ladies' auxiliary is planning to testify on behalf of Dinah's character. Apparently, abandoning a bride at the altar is considered poor form, even by her standards. But community support could only go so far against legal documents and mining surveys." Harold had returned to Prairie Bluff with a retinue of lawyers, engineers, and railroad representatives who had taken over the hotel and begun treating the town as if they already owned it. They conducted themselves with the arrogance of men accustomed to getting what they wanted, regardless of who got hurt in the process. The confrontation that everyone had been dreading finally came on a Thursday afternoon. Dinah was working in the garden when a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see Harold Pemberton standing at the garden gate, impeccably dressed as always, his handsome face wearing the confident smile that had once made her heart flutter. "Hello, Dinah," he said, his voice carrying the casual intimacy of a man who considered her still his property. "You're looking well. Ranch life seems to agree with you." "Harold." Her voice was steady, though her hands tightened on the vegetables she had been harvesting. "What do you want?" "I want to talk, to explain, to make things right between us." He stepped closer, his eyes taking in the changes that ranch work had wrought in her appearance, the sun-browned skin, the calloused hands, the practical dress that had replaced her former finery. "I know my departure was sudden, unexplained, but I had good reasons, Dinah, reasons that I'm now free to share with you. I'm married, Harold. Happily married. Whatever reasons you had for leaving no longer matter." Harold's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Are you happily married to a man you barely knew who married you out of pity? Come now, Dinah, we both know this arrangement of yours is nothing more than a charitable act that's outlived its usefulness." Before Dinah could respond, Thad's voice cut across the garden like a blade. "I think you've said enough, Pemberton." Harold turned to face the approaching giant with the confidence of a man who believed money and legal documents could overcome any physical disadvantage. "Reilly, I was hoping we could discuss this situation like civilized men. Surely we can reach an understanding that benefits everyone." "The only understanding I'm interested in," Thad replied, his voice dangerously quiet, "is the one where you leave my property and never bother my wife again." "Your wife?" Harold's laugh was sharp and mocking. "A marriage performed in desperation by a woman who had no other choice? Please. We both know you took advantage of Dinah's vulnerable state for your own purposes. How noble could your motives have been when you're now sitting on a fortune in mineral rights?" The accusation hit its mark. Thad's face darkened, and for a moment, Dinah feared he might resort to the kind of violence that would only strengthen Harold's legal position. But her husband possessed the kind of self-control that came from years of handling dangerous animals and difficult situations. "Get off my land," Thad said simply. "Now." Harold's confidence never wavered. "Your land? For how much longer? My lawyers seem quite confident that this matter will be resolved in my favor within the week. Perhaps Dinah would prefer to discuss this privately, without the intimidating presence of her temporary protector." "I have nothing to discuss with you," Dinah said, stepping closer to Thad's solid presence. "You made your choice when you left me at the altar. I've made mine by staying here, by building a life with a man who honors his commitments." The barb struck home. Harold's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing the angry, entitled man beneath the polished exterior. "You think you've won something here? You think this giant farmer loves you? He married you because you were convenient, Dinah, because he needed help with his failing ranch. Do you really believe he would have looked at you twice if you hadn't? Been abandoned and desperate?" The cruel words were designed to wound, to drive a wedge between husband and wife by striking at Dinah's deepest insecurities. For a moment, they succeeded. Dinah flinched, as if she had been physically struck, doubt flickering across her features. It was Thad who answered, his voice carrying across the garden with the power of absolute conviction. "I looked at her for years before that wedding day," he said, his brown eyes never leaving Dinah's face. "I admired her, respected her, cared for her from a distance because I never thought a woman like her would consider a man like me. Your abandonment gave me the chance to offer her my protection, but it was her choice to stay, her choice to build something real with me. She could have left at any time, could have taken that teaching position, could have returned to her family. She stayed because she wanted to, not because she had to." The declaration hung in the air between them, more powerful than any legal document. Dinah's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief and recognition rather than sorrow. In that moment, surrounded by the garden they had planted together, facing the man who had once represented her future, she understood completely what she had chosen and why. "Harold," she said quietly, her voice carrying the finality of a door closing forever, "I don't care about your legal claims or your mineral rights or your explanations. I don't care what the courts decide about contracts and mining claims. This is my home, this is my family, this is my choice. Whatever happens, that will never change." Harold's facade finally cracked completely, revealing the frustrated anger of a man who was accustomed to getting his way. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice sharp with barely controlled rage. "We'll see what you choose when the alternative is poverty and disgrace." After he left, Dinah and Thad stood together in their garden, surrounded by the vegetables they had planted and tended, their hands intertwined as they faced an uncertain future. The legal battle was far from over. The threats were real and immediate, but something fundamental had been settled between them. "Did you mean it?" Dinah asked quietly. "What you said about looking at me for years?" "Every word," Thad replied, lifting their joined hands to his lips. "Harold Pemberton can claim whatever he wants about contracts and legal rights, but he can never claim to love you the way I do." That night, as they prepared for what might be their last few days as husband and wife, Thad presented Dinah with his grandmother's wedding ring set. The simple gold bands gleamed in the lamplight, symbols of commitment that transcended legal documents and territorial courts. "Whatever happens," he said as he slipped the ring onto her finger, "you'll always be my wife, not because of any contract or legal obligation, but because of choice. Your choice, my choice, our choice to love each other regardless of the consequences." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising the kind of weather that could change everything. But inside the ranch house, surrounded by family and anchored by love, Dinah felt ready to face whatever the morning might bring. The town meeting was called for Saturday morning in the church, the only building in Prairie Bluff large enough to accommodate the crowd that had gathered to witness what many considered the most important legal proceeding in the county's history. The territorial judge, a weathered man named Morrison, who had seen every kind of frontier dispute, presided over the proceedings with the weary authority of someone who had learned to expect the worst from human nature. Thad's father's watch, a simple silver timepiece that had marked the hours of 3 generations of honest work, lay heavy in his vest pocket as he sat beside Dinah in the front pew. The watch had been wound faithfully every morning by Samuel Reilly, a ritual that connected past to present, legacy to future. Now it seemed to tick away the final moments of everything the family had built. Harold Pemberton sat across the aisle with his lawyers, a picture of confidence in his expensive suit and perfectly arranged hair. Behind him, representatives from the railroad company filled an entire pew, their presence a reminder of the powerful forces arrayed against a simple ranching family. The mining surveys and legal documents they had brought filled a wooden crate, testament to months of careful preparation for this moment. "This case," Judge Morrison announced to the packed church, "concerns the validity of mining claims filed by Harold Pemberton against property currently owned by Thaddeus Reilly and his wife Dinah. Mr. Pemberton's legal team will present their case first." Harold's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Sterling from Denver, rose with theatrical confidence. His presentation was polished and persuasive, laying out a case that painted Harold as the victim of a conspiracy designed to defraud him of legitimate mining rights. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice carrying clearly through the church, "my client entered into a legally binding marriage contract with Miss Dinah Keane on February 15th of this year. This contract, properly witnessed and signed, included standard provisions regarding property rights and asset development. When urgent business called Mr. Pemberton away from Prairie Bluff, he had every reasonable expectation that the wedding would be postponed until his return. The lawyer produced the marriage contract, holding it up for the crowd to see. Instead, he returned to find that Miss Keane had married another man, in what can only be described as a deliberate attempt to circumvent the legitimate mining claims he had filed based on their contractual agreement. Sterling went on to present testimony from mining engineers who confirmed the value of the mineral deposits, railroad representatives who spoke of the territory's development needs, and character witnesses who painted Harold as a responsible businessman whose only crime had been trusting others to honor their commitments. The evidence will show, Sterling concluded, that Mr. Reilly's marriage to Miss Keane was a marriage of convenience designed specifically to defraud my client of mineral rights worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Justice demands that legitimate contracts be honored, regardless of the emotional circumstances that led to their violation. The presentation was masterful, legally sound, and devastating in its implications. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as the weight of Harold's case became clear. Even those sympathetic to Dinah and Thad had to admit that the legal arguments were compelling. When Benjamin Hartwell rose to present their defense, he looked impossibly young compared to Sterling's polished confidence, but his voice was steady as he began to dismantle Harold's carefully constructed case. "Your Honor," Hartwell said, "opposing counsel would have you believe that abandoning a bride at the altar creates binding legal obligations. They would have you believe that a man can file mining claims based on a marriage that never occurred, then disappear for months while secretly researching how to profit from his abandonment." Hartwell produced Harold's preliminary mining claim, the document that proved his knowledge of the mineral surveys before the wedding. This claim was filed 2 days before the scheduled wedding, establishing Mr. Pemberton's true motives. He wasn't a faithful fiancé called away by urgent business. He was a calculating opportunist who discovered valuable mineral deposits and abandoned his bride as part of a deliberate strategy to maximize his profit. The revelation sent shockwaves through the congregation. Even Harold's supporters seemed taken aback by the evidence of his calculated betrayal. Harold himself maintained his composure, but a slight tightening around his eyes suggested that this evidence was more damaging than his lawyers had anticipated. "Furthermore," Hartwell continued, "the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Reilly is not a convenient arrangement, as opposing counsel suggests, but a legitimate union recognized by this community, sanctified by the Church, and consummated in accordance with territorial law." Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly at this declaration. "You're prepared to provide evidence of consummation, Counselor?" "We are, Your Honor," Hartwell replied firmly, though Dinah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at the public discussion of such private matters. The crowd stirred restlessly, sensing that the case was approaching its crucial moment. Everything they had built together, everything they had come to cherish, hung in the balance of legal arguments and territorial statutes that seemed inadequate to measure the worth of love, loyalty, and chosen family. The moment of truth arrived when Judge Morrison called Dinah to testify. She rose from the pew with quiet dignity, her hand briefly touching the new marriage certificate that Hartwell had prepared, a document that would replace their hasty wedding. With a renewed commitment, symbolizing their choice to love each other freely rather than from necessity. As Dinah walked to the front of the church, every eye followed her progress. She wore her best dress, the blue silk that had been her second choice for the original wedding, and carried herself with the poise of a woman who had found her strength through adversity. "Mrs. Reilly," Judge Morrison said gently, "please tell the court about your marriage to the defendant." Dinah's voice was clear and steady as she began her testimony. "Your Honor, when Harold Pemberton left me at the altar, I was humiliated, heartbroken, and facing social disgrace. Thad Reilly offered me his protection and his name when I had nowhere else to turn. But what began as an act of kindness became something far more precious. She looked directly at Harold as she continued, her green eyes holding no trace of the vulnerable woman he had abandoned. I learned that the man I thought I loved was capable of calculated cruelty, while the man I barely knew possessed a depth of honor and compassion that I had never imagined possible. Sterling rose to object, but Judge Morrison waved him down. "Continue, Mrs. Reilly. My marriage to Thad is real in every sense that matters," Dinah declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. "We share a home, a life, hopes for the future. We've worked side by side to build something meaningful together. The love between us grew from respect, from shared values, from the daily choice to honor our commitment to each other." Harold's face had grown pale during her testimony, the confident mask finally beginning to slip. When Sterling cross-examined Dinah, his questions grew increasingly aggressive, but she met each challenge with unshakable composure. "Mrs. Reilly," Sterling said sharply, "isn't it true that you married Mr. Reilly purely out of desperation? That you had no other choice after my client's departure?" "I had choices," Dinah replied firmly. "I could have returned to my parents' home. I could have left Prairie Bluff entirely. I could have accepted the teaching position that was offered to me. I chose to stay because I wanted to build a life with my husband." When Thad took the stand, his testimony was equally powerful, but delivered in his characteristic quiet manner. He spoke of his growing love for Dinah, of the partnership they had built, of the family they had created with her sisters. His honesty was compelling, his sincerity evident to everyone in the room. The turning point came when Mave was called to testify. She strode to the front of the church with characteristic fire in her eyes, and her testimony was devastating too. "Harold's case. Harold Pemberton is a coward and a liar," she declared bluntly, ignoring Sterling's objections. "He abandoned my sister not because of urgent business, but because he discovered this ranch might be valuable and wanted to steal it legally. He's not here for love or justice, he's here for money." The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement. Even Harold's supporters seemed shaken by the passionate conviction of Mave's words. The final blow to Harold's case came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife who had initially been skeptical of the Reilly household arrangement, rose to address the court. "Your Honor," she said in her crisp, authoritative voice, "I have known the Keane family for 20 years and the Reilly family for even longer. What I have witnessed over the past months is a true marriage, a genuine partnership, and a love that honors both families' traditions. Mr. Pemberton's claim is an insult to the institution of marriage and to the decent people of this community." Her words carried enormous weight, coming from a woman whose social standing made her opinion influential throughout the county. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess, then returned to deliver his verdict. The church fell silent as he cleared his throat and began to speak. "This court finds that the marriage between Thaddeus Reilly and Dinah Keane Reilly is valid and legally binding in all respects. Mr. Pemberton's mining claims are therefore invalid, as they were based on a marriage contract that was nullified by his abandonment of the bride." The church erupted in cheers from the community members who had supported the Reillys throughout the ordeal. Harold's face went white with shock and rage, while his lawyers immediately began discussing appeals and alternative legal strategies. But the most important moment came when Dinah and Thad embraced in the front of the church, their relief and joy visible to everyone present. They had won more than a legal victory. They had publicly affirmed their choice to love each other, to build a life together, to be a family in the truest sense. As the crowd dispersed and the legal teams packed their documents, the 4 members of the Reilly household walked home together, their unity stronger than ever after being tested by forces that had tried to tear them apart. 6 months later, the spring of 1875 brought changes to the Reilly ranch that would have seemed impossible during those dark October days when their future hung in the balance of a territorial court decision. The baby cradle that Thad had crafted, During the long winter evenings, sat in the corner of the main bedroom, its smooth pine wood gleaming with careful attention and hope for the future they were building together. Dinah stood at the kitchen window, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, watching her husband work with the cattle in the distance. The mineral rights that had nearly destroyed their happiness had ultimately secured their prosperity. Harold's legal defeat had cleared the way for legitimate mining operations, conducted in partnership with a reputable company that respected both the land and the people who worked it. The steady income from mineral leases had transformed the struggling ranch into a thriving operation, allowing them to expand the herd, improve the facilities, and plan for a future that stretched as far as the prairie horizon. "You're glowing," Mave observed, entering the kitchen with her arms full of packages from town. Her partnership in Henderson's general store had proved remarkably successful, and she had recently announced her engagement to Deputy Sheriff Collins, a quiet man whose steady nature complemented her fiery temperament perfectly. "Motherhood suits you even before the baby arrives," Dinah smiled, turning from the window to help her sister unpack supplies. "I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, the contentment in her voice reflecting the deep satisfaction she had found in her new life. It's strange to think that Harold's betrayal led to all of this happiness. The teaching position at the Prairie Bluff school had been offered to her again that spring, but Dinah had declined without hesitation. Her life was here now, with the ranch, with Thad, with the family they were creating together. She had discovered that there were many ways to nurture and educate, and her work with the ranch's account books, her partnership in major decisions, and her coming role as a mother fulfilled her in ways that a classroom never could. Norah had married Thomas Morrison in a Christmas ceremony that had been everything her sister's original wedding was supposed to be: joyful, celebrated, surrounded by family and friends who genuinely wished the couple well. She lived now on the neighboring Morrison ranch, close enough for daily visits, but far enough to establish her own household. Her gentle wisdom had proven invaluable in helping Thomas expand his operation, and their marriage was already being held up as an example of what true partnership could accomplish. "She's coming for dinner tonight," Mave continued, referring to Norah's weekly visits. "And she's bringing news that she's practically bursting to share." The sound of boots on the porch announced Thad's return from the day's work. He entered the kitchen with the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in the world, his face lighting up when he saw his wife. The shy, uncertain bachelor who had married Dinah out of kindness had grown into a respected rancher, a loving husband, and a man whose opinion carried weight throughout the county. "How are my girls today?" he asked, his large hands gently encompassing Dinah's waist as he spoke to both her and their unborn child. "Perfectly well," Dinah replied, leaning back against his solid warmth, "and eager to hear what progress you've made with the new barn." The barn that was rising behind the house would be the finest in 3 counties, built with profits from the mineral leases and designed to accommodate the expanded herd they planned for the future. It represented stability, prosperity, and the confidence to plan for generations to come. That evening, as they gathered around the dinner table that had become the heart of their home, Norah shared her anticipated news. She was expecting her first child due in late autumn, which meant that cousins would grow up together on neighboring ranches, surrounded by the love and support of extended family. "Another baby," Mave said with satisfaction, raising her glass of cider in toast. "This family keeps growing in the most wonderful ways." As they celebrated the news, Dinah reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. That the woman who had been abandoned at the altar, humiliated and heartbroken, had become the center of a loving family, the partner of a devoted husband, the mother of children yet to be born. The sisters who had once clung to each other out of necessity had found the courage to build their own lives while maintaining the bonds that would always unite them. Later that night, as Dinah and Thad sat on the front porch watching the sunset, paint the prairie in shades of gold and rose. They talked about their plans for the ranch, for their children, for the life they would build together in this place that had become so much more than either had dared to hope. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Harold hadn't run away?" Thad asked, his arm around her shoulders as they swayed gently on the porch swing. "Sometimes," Dinah admitted, "but I can't imagine being anywhere else, being anyone else than who I am right now. His betrayal led me to you, to this life, to this happiness. I almost want to thank him for being such a coward." "Almost," Thad agreed with a chuckle, "but not quite." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sounds of their prosperous ranch, secure in their love and confident in their future. The baby cradle waited in their bedroom, ready to welcome the next generation of their chosen family. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, full of possibility and promise. Sometimes the deepest wounds do lead to the greatest healing. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals open doors to unimaginable happiness. And sometimes the woman you married out of kindness becomes the person you cannot imagine living without, the center of your world, the heart of your home, the love of your lifetime.